So as I think about what I want you to recognize, I realize I could just say this and step off the stage. Think about the two men you've just seen speak. I've known both of them for many years. I love each of them. They are dear friends. They are completely different people. Completely different people. They each have excelled and they each will be superstars in their field, but if they sat down and they talked about the politics of what America should do, from gun control to the budget, to climate change legislation, to the issues around Wall Street, I'm sure they'd have 1,000 arguments before you. Yet these two fundamentally different souls stood here and agreed about something fundamental, passionately argued about something fundamental about this democracy. These two souls from two different sides of a political spectrum see the same thing. And this is an important fact, an incredibly important fact. Gallup did a poll at the beginning of this year where they asked Americans, what are the top issues that our government has got to solve? And as befits the polarized character of our nation, they ordered the issues according to whether the Republicans ranked them, or the independents ranked them, or the Democrats ranked them. And the Republicans and independents and Democrats rank issues differently. So number 9 on the Republican list was the rich-poor gap. That was ranked number 6 for independents and Democrats. Number 6 on the Republicans' list was ethics and morals. That was number 9 for the independents and number 7 for Democrats. Number 4 for Republicans is the federal deficit. That's number 5 for independents, and of course number 9 for the Democrats. So this is a picture of just how different we Americans are. But then look at the line I've erased, because this is the punchline. When they asked Republicans and independents and Democrats, what's the most important issue that we have got to address, that we have got to solve, that we've got to find a way to move beyond, the number 1 answer for all of them was the same: government. This is our number 1 problem, our government. Now, by government, they put together dissatisfaction with government or Congress or politicians, poor leadership, corruption, abuse of power. But here's the point. The point you've just seen tonight, the point that Buddy and Cenk showed you. This is the one thing that we Americans all agree about. Something fundamental has gone wrong with our government, and we have to find a way to fix it. Now, something is a little bit too ambiguous. It turns out we know what thing has gone wrong with our government. We know it. We did a poll before the Gallup poll by the Global Strategy Group. And we asked Americans, do you think our current political system works well? We were trying to figure out whether they were listening or not. And of course, 80% said it is in need of reform. We asked them, do you think our political system is corrupt or not? 71% said it was corrupt. But then we asked them, how important is it to you that the influence of money in politics be reduced? And 96% of Americans said it was important that the influence of money in politics be reduced. 68% said very important, but 96% said important. Now, it turns out there are about 7% of Americans who are lobbyists, so that kind of explains what the 4% is about. But this is the measure. This is the Cenk and Buddy show. It is all of us who believe the influence of money in politics must be reduced, 96%. Now, that question, 96%, begs the question, what do we mean by influence? What is that influence that has to be reduced? What's its character? What's its nature? And the thing to recognize when we think about this problem with money in politics, see, it's really cute the way I do the dollar sign at the end of politics. That's the money in politics way to say it. Okay, so politics. The problem with money in politics, this influence, can either be an influence that's operating on Americans through the political campaign ads that are put out there. That could be the problem with the influence, but I don't think that's in fact the problem people think about when they think about the influence of money in politics. What they're thinking about is the influence on government itself, on the politicians themselves. Because this is the problem. The problem with Washington is not the amount of money, it's not how the money is spent. The problem with Washington is the way the money is raised. The way the money is raised. The problem is not the speech the money buys. The problem is the fundraising itself. That is the dynamic that produces the corruption that Buddy Roemer just told you about. The fact is, members of Congress and candidates for Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power. And it doesn't take a PhD in psychology to think this through. We need to think, what does it do to them to spend their time dialing for dollars to people all across the country, raising the money they need to get back to power or to get their party back to power? B.F. Skinner, a professor of psychology at Harvard, gave us this image of the Skinner box, which is a device which, I don't want you to listen to Skinner, which is a device to show that you can teach even a stupid bird exactly what sequence of buttons it needs to push to get the food it needs to get its sustenance. We need to recognize this is the picture of a modern American congressperson. As they sit there on the phone and learn what buttons they must push to get the sustenance they need. They learn it just like the pigeon does. At least I didn't put a rat up there. That might have been more appropriate. But any animal can learn it as they do it again and again for hours and hours. They learn how they need to speak. Now, in fact, I don't think the fact they call people for 4 to 6 hours a day is a bad thing. If they were randomly calling their constituents for 4 to 6 hours a day, that might be a good thing. If they were randomly calling their people they're representing and saying to them, what do you think? What do you think's going on? What do you think of what we're doing? That would be progress. Because then they'd be listening in the way that pigeon was to what their constituents thought, and they might be more responsive. But they're not randomly calling their constituents. What they're doing is calling a tiny fraction of Americans. And indeed, if you look at the statistics that are published by Open Secrets, you can see that who they're calling is 0.05% of America. 0.05% of America are getting those telephone calls, while 99.95% of America are not. 150,000 Americans are the recipients of those telephone calls. Turns out that's about the same as the number of Lesters in the world. In America, I know this is true because the internet told me that. That led me in my TED Talk to sort of characterize our democracy as Lesterland. That's where we live, Lesterland, because it's this tiny number of Americans who have this extraordinary power because they are getting the calls by the pigeons who are trying to raise the money they need to get back to Congress. Now, as they do this, as these congressmen do this, as these quintessentially human people do this, as any of us would, they develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness of how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shape-shifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money, not on issues 1 to 10, the issues their constituents might even notice something about, but on issues 11 to 1,000. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, always lean to the green. Then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. So this is the point They live this life constantly recognizing what they must do to please the 150,000 Americans who are funding their campaigns, and they slowly bend themselves in that direction. And as they do that, this is what they believe. Whether it's true or not is not important. This is what they believe. If they don't win the fundraising game, they can't win the election. If they don't win the fundraising game, they can't win the election. And so they try as hard as they possibly can to win the fundraising game. Now, we should recognize what this means we've built in America. We now have a system of 2 elections in America, 2 elections. There's a voting election, a discrete event, which happens on a particular day, twice every election cycle, the general election and the primaries. A discrete event. And there is the money primary, an event that happens continuously, 24/7, between one election and the next, as politicians are constantly pleading with their funders to give them money. Now, in the voting election, citizens get to vote. All citizens get to vote if you're 18 or over, some states if you have an ID. But in the money primary, it's the relevant funders of the campaigns who get to vote, the relevant funders. So the voting election, we all as citizens participate. The money election, 0.05% of us participate. Now that picture of a, quote, democracy, end quote. You know it's a democracy because your civics teacher told you that. Cenk told you it's not, but what does he know? That democracy, that picture of a democracy, that picture is a picture of corruption. Corruption. Now, I don't believe it's corruption in the old-fashioned brown paper bag secreting cash to members of Congress type of corruption. It's not corruption in the Rob Blagojevich sense of corruption. What I'm talking about is not any criminal act by any member of Congress. I'm perfectly willing to believe these are perfectly decent, hardworking, honest people. It's a little bit of a stretch for some, okay, but hardworking, decent, honest people who are doing what they can inside of a terrible system, which is why 15 years ago, in his presidential campaign, beginning here in New Hampshire, in Bedford, on June 30th, 1999, John McCain said his campaign was going to be about the, quote, system of corruption in Washington, the system of corruption. He wasn't talking, he said, about individuals. He wasn't calling out particular senators as being corrupt. He said that system corrupts all of us. All of us are corrupted by the system. And he launched a campaign here to focus on that problem. System of corruption. Corrupt because it is not a government representing, as the framers promised it would, all of us, a government dependent on the people alone. It's not the government they designed where we the people stand on top and they are dependent on us. The problem with this government is that increasingly there's another dependency, the dependency on the funders. That additional dependency, that competing dependency, that conflicting dependency is corruption. It is the dependence corruption. It is a system of corruption. Whatever flavor you want to call it, we have to call it for what it is. It is corruption. Now, 96% of Americans think that influence of funding has to be reduced. And these guys, these are pundits, don't think it's a serious problem. They don't think it's a serious problem in the political sense because they believe Americans don't care about this issue. They believe Americans don't care enough about this issue to do something about it. To do something about it. And they use as evidence for that the fact that it's hard to get people out and rallied around this issue. Indeed, someone said to me, your friend Buddy Roemer proves people don't care about this issue. Because you've seen who could be a more articulate spokesman for this cause, who spent years in this state, and yet you didn't see him at the top of the ballot in January 2012. But I think the pundits are wrong here. And it turns out this is the very first time ever the pundits have been wrong. But it turns out this time they're wrong. And here's the clue to why they're wrong. Though 96% of Americans believe the influence of money in politics should be reduced, what we found in that same poll was we asked then, how likely do you think it is that the influence of money in politics is reduced in the next few years? How likely? And we found 91% of Americans think it's not likely. It's not likely. They want it, but it's not likely. And so what this means is when you take 96% wanting something and you set it up against 91% who believe it's not going to happen, what that produces is resignation about the issue, and acceptance about a reality you don't like, but what are you going to do about it? When I was a young kid, I had to resign myself to the fact that I was never going to do that. It was a hard fact for me to accept as a young child because I really wanted to do that. And I think, if we did a poll, we'd find 96% of Americans would want to be able to do that. But at least 91% of us realize none of us are ever going to do that, which explains why most of us don't leap off of buildings regularly trying to do that. What we do is resign ourselves to the fact that only Superman flies, and we will not fly. We resign ourselves to the fact it's not possible, so we don't try. We don't try. But here's the fact. You know this fact is true. It must be possible. It must be possible. We don't have a choice about whether it's possible or not. We don't have that choice.
So when Buddy came to talk to me about his
because
idea
the
to run for
problems
president,
we face as a nation are just too great.
I recognized as I
Commitments
saw
we have to our
the
children
fact that he
and
was
our
shut
parents
out of the process because the pundit said it's
are
not
just
possible
too real.
to win without
It
taking
must
the big
be
money.
possible.
I realized what we needed
So when Buddy came
What
to
we
talk to
needed
me
to do
about his
before
idea
he
to run for
ran
president, and I
was to have a
encouraged
little
and supported
conversation,
him,
a little quiet
we recognized
conversation
as I saw
with the people in New
the
Hampshire.
fact that he was shut out of the
Saying to
process
people in New
because
Hampshire,
the pundit
you've
said
been
it's
sitting
not
like couch
possible
potatoes
to win.
as the politicians
without
have
taking
been
the
blasting
big
their
money.
commercials at you every 4
realized
years.
what
I
we
guess it's
needed-
every year. They do it all
what
the
we
time.
needed to
right?
do before
every
he
4
ran
years, telling you what to do.
was to
And so
have a
you're
little
listening
conversation,
politely.
little quiet conversation
This time,
with the people
you're
in
going
New
to turn
Hampshire.
the table around.
And say to the people in New Hampshire,
This time,
you've been sitting
you
like
can't
couch
just play
potatoes
the game with them.
as
You
the
gotta
politicians
change
have
the
been
game
blasting
they
their
play.
commercials at you every
This time
4
you've gotta
years. I
ask
guess it's every
them
year. They do it
and
all the time,
force
right?
them to
Every
address
4
a
years,
question
telling
they
you what to
don't
do.
want
Sitting
to
around
talk
listening
about.
politely.
In July of 2012,
But this time, you got to turn
Gallup
the table
asked
around.
Americans, what are the top issues
This
the next
time,
president should address?
You can't just play the game with them. You got to
And
change
even
the
though
game
no
they
one
play
would listen to what Buddy was
This time
talking
you've
about,
got to
number
ask
2
them
on that list
and force them to
was
address
the
a question
corruption
they
in
don't
Washington.
want
The
to talk about.
corruption in Washington. And by
In
corruption,
July of
nobody was thinking about
2012.
Rob Blagojevich or Randy Duke Cunningham.
Gallup asked
Those
Americans,
issues
what
were not before
are
the
the
American
top
people.
issues
What
the
was
next
before
president
the
should
American people were the unbelievable amounts of money being
And
spent
even
by
though
super PACs.
no one
That was
would
the
listen to
issue
what Buddy was
that
talking
people
about,
were talking
number
about.
2
And
on
when
that
people
list
were talking about that, and they were asked,
was
what
the
should we fix?
corruption
They
in
said,
Washington.
fix
The corruption in Washington. And by corruption, nobody was thinking about Rob
But
Blagojevich
did
or
Romney
Randy Duke Cunningham.
or Obama even mention
Those
that
issues
issue?
were not before the American
Was
people.
it
What
on
was
their
before the
webpage,
American
even at the
people
very-
were the unbelievable amounts of money being spent by super PACs. That was the issue that people were talking about. And when people were talking about that and they were asked, what should we fix? They said, fix the corruption. But did Romney or Obama even mention that issue? Was it on their webpage, even at the very bottom of the list of things they were going to address when they got to Washington? No, it was invisible, completely invisible, because they're embarrassed. It's like you're living next to an alcoholic. And when you say, what should that guy deal with? the first thing on your head is he's got to deal with his addiction. But what does he talk about? What does he talk to his friends about? Not his addiction. So we had to find a way. We have to find a way. We should have found a way to get New Hampshire to get together and say, look, we can do this differently. We can talk about these issues differently. We can get people to talk to us differently. We can get them to show us the respect of talking about the issue we think is the most important issue. Because in July 2012, it was number 2. According to the poll we just ran, it is number 1 today. Number 1. But they won't talk about it unless you make them. And this state alone has the power to make them. Because they will be in your living rooms, in your coffee shops, on your front steps, on your streets, in your Rotary clubs, in this place 100 times. Yesterday, I understand Donald Trump was here. 100 times you will see these people. And you can ask them directly, look, I'm happy to listen to your mysticism about how you're going to create jobs and all that sort of stuff. I'm happy to listen to that stuff. That same stuff I listen to every single time. No, we like jobs. No, we like jobs. No, we like jobs. No, fine, I'll listen to that. But after you tell me this, we the people think this issue is the most important problem. What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? That was the idea behind what we called the New Hampshire Rebellion. Now, we said rebellion because this is an amazing state. In its constitution, Article 10 is a clause that expressly protects the right of the people to rebel. It says it is, quote unquote, absurd to deny the right of the people to revolution. It's one of only 3 states in the Constitution in the United States whose Constitution uses the word absurd. It's kind of cute, absurd in a Constitution. So there it is. This is your tradition. You have that right protected. We didn't think too far down the road because, okay, Iowa, New Hampshire, the Iowa rebellion's fine, New Hampshire rebellion's fine. South Carolina rebellion doesn't quite ring the same way, okay? But fine, we're focused on New Hampshire. And here's the facts. 15 years ago, here in New Hampshire was the focus for fundamental reform. July 1st, 1999, Doris Haddock, aka Granny D, started in Los Angeles at the age of 88 and started a trek across the United States, ending up in Washington 13 months later at the age of 90, with a sign on her chest that said Campaign Finance Reform. And as I said, on June 30th, this man came to this state and he talked about his campaign to be focused on the system of corruption in Washington. And he won in this state, I believe, and many believe, because he spoke about that issue and resonated strong with the citizens of New Hampshire, and then got in trouble for completely outrageous reasons in South Carolina, of course, none of his own doing. But this was the focus 15 years ago here. And we have to revive that focus. We have to find a way to bring back this issue in a way that makes it impossible for candidates to talk in this state without answering the question, what will they do about this problem? Now, the first step, we believe, to getting to that place is to begin to recruit people here, to volunteer to do a very simple thing. Some people might be afraid, but it turns out it's a simple thing. The simple thing is to ask a question. We want to recruit people to volunteer to go to every single event they can where a presidential candidate is speaking, so that between now and 2016, at every single event, there is someone at that event who stands up and says, how are you going to end the system of corruption in D.C.? Now, you'll get pushback originally. What do you mean, corruption in D.C.? Who are the criminals? Who are the criminals? When John McCain started his campaign, Mitch McConnell went on the floor of the United States Senate. And he said, I want McCain to name names. I want the senator to tell me who he's talking about. Who are the criminals? You can't have a gang of gangsters without any criminal acts. So who are they? And McCain came to the floor of the Senate and he said, Mr. Senator, Senator McConnell, I'm not saying anyone individually is a criminal. I'm saying the system is corrupt. The system is corrupt. All of us are corrupt because of this system. So the first pushback when they say, who are the corrupt people, is, I didn't say, how are you going to end corruption? I said, how are you going to end the system of corruption? And what is that system of corruption? What 96% of us believe: the influence of money over politics. That is the question they must answer. And then, as they ask that question, we will collect the answers. We will have volunteers who capture the video of those answers, and we will post it, and we will invite people to critique it, so there is a dialogue, a conversation, a way to make in the surface of that campaign this issue as the #1 issue. So that's the objective, to begin that conversation. And to begin that conversation, we took some steps. Quite literally, we took some steps. In fact, many tens of thousands of steps, because we have, since January 11th, been marching from Dixville Notch, and on Friday we'll end up in Nashua. 185 miles across New Hampshire, and you might remember, it's January. 195 miles across this state to begin to recruit and rally people to this issue. And as we've done it, this incredible band of brothers and sisters and I, as we've done this, we have found extraordinary passion among New Hampshireites for this issue. Most passionately in the North, where people almost cry and scream for someone to take this issue up and do something credible about it. They come out of their houses, they put signs on their front lawns, they honk their horns, they stick their thumbs out of their window. Some lean out of the window. That's a bad idea. Don't ever do that. But they yell and they support what we're doing because they agree this is the critical issue. And we've had enormous connection and response. And we've had an amazing set of volunteers who have been trying to put this together. I've been asked to show this very short little video that was done by one of our original Roostriker volunteers to capture what has happened over this week. So I'm going to give you this 2-minute video right now. You can go to sleep if you want, but I'll wake you up in a second. So we're walkers, and we are walking to help build the movement of ordinary citizens who are not running for anything, but are out here trying to convince the rest of us we actually have an opportunity. 50,000 New Hampshireites could change the presidential election. If 50,000 New Hampshireites got together and said, this is my issue, that would change 2016.
But everybody came in here and asked, why are people walking? The government problems, has always been there for centuries, decades. And it's going to take more than one person or a group of people to step in and do something about it. And with the small towns that you guys are doing are probably a good start.
I thought they're very dedicated to be up on a day like today and very sincere about it. And it's good to see that people want things to go back to where they were, you know. That's what built this country.
I just want to make sure everyone's hit the restroom and topped off water bottles before heading outside.
Pretty good. You know, I worry most about my feet.
Yeah.
And they're just getting a little tender, but they're fine. I don't have any big blisters or anything, any real nasties.
That's perfect. All right, so Band-Aid, moleskin, and we're golden.
Okay,
For like an hour, and then
If it weren't for Larry, clearly I would not be walking down the length of New Hampshire, and I won't be doing it for a day, but it's been an amazing experience to be walking with these guys. And,
We didn't expect was how quickly everybody would know about it. So as we're marching down, street, people are honking, or coming out and waving, and
It's beautiful. Well, the interesting thing about New Hampshire is that, because the presidential primaries come through every 4 years, they're very political. They're very politically aware.
when you meet them and talk about it, the standard thing the pundits say is that nobody cares about this issue. But the reality is they don't care about this issue because most people don't believe it's possible to fix it.
I'm really here because I am devoting my full-time effort to the movement to get money out of politics. because I believe it's the root cause of most of what's wrong with our country.
This is what this country needs, you know, is just some basic reforms. We're not off track by too much, but we got to get together on something like this, and I think it would work.
Like, amazing group. Like I've said to a couple people lately, I've never before had like been randomly thrown in with a large group of people and then liked all of them so much. And then the people that we met in New Hampshire have been incredible. And it makes me feel like it's possible, like we're going along and affecting each place that we're at, and then carried on this wave of support forward. I feel like I believe in hope and optimism again.
So in the audience, you can see the people who've been marching, and they're wearing their shirts. And I'd just like you to acknowledge what I know all of you feel like now for what they've been doing. But here's the skeptical question. Is it possible? Is it really possible to do something here? And the numbers are a reason why this seems eminently possible. This is a state with just 1.1 million people, 750,000 voters. But if you look, for example, at 2008 in the Democratic primary, the difference between Clinton and Obama was 8,000 votes. And in 2012, the difference between the top two, Romney and Paul, was about 40,000 votes. So imagine, out of a population of 750,000 voters, if we can recruit 50,000 of them, just 50,000 of them, to commit themselves openly and strongly to make this the first issue, not the most important issue. They might care about the deficit or about tax reform. They might think that's the most important issue. But the first issue, because they recognize if we don't fix this issue, we can't fix any other issue either. Like with the neighbor, you realize unless he addresses his alcoholism, he can't address any of the other problems he faces. It's the first issue. If we had 50,000 people to ask and demand an answer to this and push back when they get non-answers to this question and recruit others to support this, imagine the shape shifting then. As the advisors to those political candidates coming into this state begin to say, hey, look, how are you going to distinguish yourself from 30 other Republicans? How are you going to distinguish yourself from 4 other progressive Democrats? What's going to make you look different? And then shape-shifting becomes our friend. As they discover, oh, I was with Buddy in 1983 when he was taking on the bank lobbies without money from the banks. I've been with this issue from the very beginning. And when they say that, let's not call them on it. Let's encourage it. Let's encourage their newfound commitment to the issue we think is number one and most important. Now, as I've done this, as I've walked this, I've learned something important, I think, about the nature of how we engage and get people working. I've discovered what many people have known and I've been oblivious to for my whole life. The important place in our politics of the walker. You know, there are people who run. Buddy was one of those people. They're important. We need them. There are people who sit. I was one of those people. I met Granny D never in person. I met her because she wanted to be a guest blogger on my blog. I sat most of the time writing and submitting things for, and she wanted to be on there when she ran for Senate in 2004, so that's how I met her. I was a sitter while she was a runner. But in addition to people who run and sit, there are people who walk. And it's different from both. Granny D walked, But others, of course, through our history and through world history, have been important walkers. And walking does something. In the hours it takes to cover the 20 miles that we covered for many of the days, today just 18, there's time for conversations about why are you here? What are you doing this for? What makes you leave your family, as Bruce did with his young children, and come spend 2 weeks on the road? What makes you do something like this? And as you have those conversations, you build bonds, friendships, commitments. These are my brothers and sisters. I will be with them for the rest of my life. We will always be connected, always connected. And you build the strength this movement needs of people who have seen and felt the pain of 20 hours, 20 miles a day, but the commitment and the passion we've seen in response. We become walkers. I call myself now, and all of us I think are GD walkers, and don't think that. That's Granny D walkers I'm saying here. We are Granny D walkers. And we will move this cause ahead through this act. But it turns out this act of walking is particularly relevant to this fight. Particularly relevant to this fight because of this man, also a walker. So this is a man named Dr. Lonnie Smith. Dr. Lonnie Smith lived in Texas in the early part of the last century. And Dr. Lonnie Smith, as you can see, is African American. And in Texas, until 1942, African Americans were not permitted to vote in the primary. The Democratic primary had a rule, said no African Americans can vote. Now that might puzzle you, because you probably remember that after the Civil War in 1870, we enacted a 15th Amendment that expressly said you could not deny the right to vote on the basis of race. But then some clever lawyers figured out how to, in fact, deny the vote on the basis of race. And it went to the Supreme Court a number of times, and in 1937, the Supreme Court unanimously upheld the right of Texas to exclude African Americans from the primaries. Unanimously. But Dr. Lonnie Smith didn't believe in America anyone should be disenfranchised. So every election, he would get up, he would walk the 4 miles he needed to walk to get to the polling place. He would pay his poll tax, because then there was a poll tax as well as exclusion. And he would say to the worker, the polling station, I would now like my ballot. And the worker would say, Dr. Smith, you know you are not allowed to vote. And he would say, thank you, and he would turn around and walk home. And that simple act of peacefully, defiantly, walking to demand what every citizen is entitled to in a quote-unquote democracy, built recognition, built a movement. And Dr. Lonnie Smith is the plaintiff in the case Smith versus Allwright, in which the Supreme Court finally made it all right by finally ending the 70 years of discrimination that had blocked African Americans from participating, not just in Texas, but across the whole South. Now think about what the Old South was then. The Old South was a place where there were 2 elections, a general election and a white primary. And in the general election, all citizens got to vote, but in the white primary, only whites got to vote. The court got it eventually. Most Americans recognized it when they saw it, but that is not a picture of a democracy. That is not a picture of a democracy that lives to the ideals our framers gave us. Now you recognize that picture, right? You recognize that picture because it's this picture too. We now also have a voting election and a exclusive primary. It's the money primary. But unlike the white primary, where 88% of the citizens of Texas were allowed to participate, In this primary, in this exclusive primary, it's only 0.05% of Americans who get to participate. It's not even the majority. It's not even the 1% minority. It is a 20th of 1% minority who has the power to determine the primary that determines who's elected, that determines the policies our government will consider. Every walker is an inspiration. Granny D was an inspiration. Dr. Smith is an inspiration. And as I think about the fight that he helped push, the fight that African Americans participated in, the fight that white Americans helped African Americans participate in to enfranchise Americans, a fight of the minority against the majority. Not quite as extreme as the one that Zhang told you about, where women who didn't have the vote eventually got the vote, but just about as bad, a minority fighting to get the vote from a majority. If they can win that fight, we can win ours. We're not just the 99%. We are the 99.95%. The 99.95%, and we can build a movement to claim our rights to equal dignity as citizens too. So please, join us in that fight. At our site, you can learn how to walk with us. There are just 2 days where you can have that privilege. Tomorrow is a difficult one. The next day is not quite as difficult. Tomorrow we get to Merrimack. The last day we go from Merrimack to Nashua, 6 miles. And we welcome all comers. Or you can sign up on our site to be part of this movement, to be part of the 50,000. And I hope you sign up on this site also to pledge to be one of the people who stands before these candidates again and again and again and says, how are you going to end the system of corruption in Washington? Now, you heard this slogan before, we can do this. But I don't think that's the way we should think about this. It's not that we can. It's that we must do this. We must do this. Because we have children, and we have parents, and we owe them. We owe them things that we need a government to help us to secure to them. A future, security, a healthy planet, an economy that grows again. We owe this to them. And if you organize, we can give it back to them. So Robert Frost was right. I can guarantee you the woods are lovely, dark, and deep. But we all have promises to keep. And miles to go before we sleep. Just about 25 miles before we can sleep. Thank you very much.